Hey, we're really excited to have you join us for what is honestly one of my favorite programs of the entire day, of the entire year. Now, my name is Brian. I'm an educator here at the National Constitution Center, where we are, of course, today celebrating the 236th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. Now, what we'll be doing is celebrating by bringing together a few historic figures from throughout American history who really help embody some of the big principles, key principles of one very special part of our Constitution. It's really going to help to celebrate a new exhibit we have, as well as the text of it right behind me, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. As you can see here, Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of a religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the people to peaceably to assemble or petition the government for a redress of grievances. It's kind of a mouthful, huh, folks? Absolutely. But we're going to try to get a little better, a little simpler idea of what that means and how these folks really help shape those ideas. So I suppose I'm going to take my seat and introduce our friends here. Seated beside me to my left or to your right, we have William Penn. We have Benjamin Franklin. Hello, Dr. Franklin. We have Dora Lewis, and we have Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Are there some familiar names for you folks? Do we know any of these people already? Seeing some hands up. Well, a lot that were down. So, okay, with that in mind, I suppose we should do some introductions. You know what? I might start with the furthest from me, and then we can work our way, if you don't mind, Mr. Penn. We can, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, the last shall be first, yes?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
In our chronological order. All right, thank Ms. Harper, please, thank you.
Yes, good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and I was actually born in Baltimore, Maryland, but I spent a lot of time here in Philadelphia. I actually have a house on Bainbridge Street. Some of you may be familiar with that. I was an abolitionist and also a suffragist. And it's a pleasure to be with you all this morning and to talk a little bit about our First Amendment.
I am probably the most unknown person who is sitting here today. My name is Dora Kelly Lewis, and yes, I am a Philadelphian, and I am proud of that fact. I am also the National Woman Party's ratification chair for the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which gives women the right to vote. Votes for women.
Thank you. I wish we had done that sooner, Ms. Lewis. Yes.
So do I.
Yes. My name is Benjamin Franklin. I was not born here in Philadelphia. I didn't come here until I was 17 years old. Was running away from home. But I consider myself a Philadelphian, even though I will go on to live about 18 years in London and 9 years in Paris. I always come back to Philadelphia. You may know me as many things. I was a printer. I started out working with my father as making candles and soap, but I was a printer. I was a newspaper man. I was a fireman. I was a post office man. I became a diplomat and later a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I'm the only one here who was actually at the Constitutional Convention, but, and I went all the way to the second grade. I did not go past the second grade. So I don't advocate that for any of you. I think you're all past that. But anyway, I could talk about that later. Thank you.
I know it's kind of unusual to get used to, sir.
Well, one must get used to things to get by in life. Yes, my name is William Penn. And to understand me, it is important to remember that I am, in fact, a Quaker. Everyone has heard of the Quakers, of course. We have here the Quaker city, Philadelphia, in the Quaker state, Pennsylvania, and everyone has eaten the oatmeal. But the Quakers have nothing to do with the oatmeal. The oatmeal belongs to Pepsi-Cola. Nothing for sale called Quaker is made by Quakers. If you want something that was made by a Quaker family, that's Cadbury chocolate, quite good. But the Quakers would not put their names to anything so crass as a product to be sold for profit. The Quakers started out in England, all the way back in the 1650s, back when everybody was miserable. There'd been a civil war in England, and everything was falling apart, including the king. He lost his head for losing the war. Nobody was happy. There were wars and rumors of wars, pestilence, famines, fires, floods, earthquakes. Nobody knew what was going to happen next. In other words, it was exactly like today. A young man named George Fox had been traveling the land looking for something to do with his life, which is what young people ought to be doing. But after 4 years of searching, George still hadn't found what he was looking for. He might as well have gone to college. He couldn't find anything that satisfied him inside, where he really lived and felt and thought. So he thought he'd start something of his own. He realized one day that life would be better if people were nicer, if they could look within themselves and find a way always to be kind and good and fair and helpful and honest and brave, but peaceful, the way people would be if only they had the courage to be that way, instead of trying to be just like everybody else. And you know what they're like. So George called his idea the Society of Friends, the Friends. And they would meet anywhere they could. They'd meet in little houses. They'd meet in the park. They'd sit in the park thinking lovely thoughts about being good people. And they'd get so excited by the thought of such a good life that they would begin to tremble and shake. And people passing by would say, "Look at those people quaking over there." And that did it. After that, everyone called them the Quakers. Here come the Quakers. But rather than fight about it, they simply accepted the name. If you can't get the skeleton out of your closet, make it dance for you. So we've been the Quakers ever since. But truly, we are the Religious Society of Friends. There's a lot more to my story, which I understand we'll get to later, but that explains who I am and what I am, and that's enough for now. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all sharing a bit of your story, folks. Now, what we're going to do, I will have a few questions for my friends here about their role or how these freedoms of religion, of press, of speech, of assembly, and petition have really shaped their experiences or the way they've exercised these rights or seen them limited. But I also want to make sure that you folks have the opportunity to ask some questions as well. That said, I have one because it is a special occasion. I do feel like I ought to ask Dr. Franklin, since you were, as you'd mentioned there, 236 years ago at the signing of the Constitution, could you tell us just a little bit about maybe what you felt that day or your experiences or thoughts on it?
Certainly. Well, this whole idea of a constitution didn't start right away. This country was already independent for 11 years since 1776, before we even started talking about a constitution. But many of us decided that we weren't really a country yet. We were 13 little countries, each doing whatever they wanted. And that was fine sometimes. But, you know, if you wanted to, if you were in Pennsylvania and you wanted to go to New Jersey and you wanted to spend your money, well, you had Pennsylvania money. They had their own money over in New Jersey, and they wouldn't always take your money. And also, there was no army. We were a new country. We had all sorts of resources here. We had a bigger country already than most of the countries in Europe. And yet, if one of those European countries had wanted to come here and if England had wanted to take us back, or if France had wanted to take us, or someone else, we had no way of defending ourselves because we had 13 states. We had a government called the Articles of Confederation, which said if anybody wants to spend any money to do anything, all 13 states had to approve it. And well, there was one state, Rhode Island, that never approved anything. And so we couldn't even defend ourselves. We couldn't even get an army together and pay an army. So there were many things like that that we just felt that we were on the threshold of being a very, very important country in this world. And it just wasn't going to work unless we had a more unified government. Not everybody agreed. Some people didn't come to talk about a constitution. And even when they did, people didn't agree on everything. There were so many compromises made that one had to be, I was always someone who felt like we needed to be reasonable. If we want something, we have to give up something. We don't get everything we want without letting someone else have something too. So many people didn't feel that way. So my feeling in the Constitutional Convention was we needed a constitution and we needed to do whatever we had to do to have it. And sometimes that meant not getting everything I wanted, but making sure that we were a better country. And so that was my feeling about the Constitution.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, at this point, I wanted to ask a few questions of our guests about their experiences either with and living under that Constitution or really embodying some of the ideas that helped shape that Constitution. So I actually might go with a little more recent history for us. As you mentioned, Ms. Lewis, you were an advocate for the chair for the ratification chair for the National Woman's Party for the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, 19 amendments made to the Constitution that you would help to sign. But in pushing for this new amendment, you and many colleagues exercised your freedoms of speech and your freedom of assembly, organizing a series of protests, demonstrations, pickets of the White House, in fact. Could you tell us about your experiences using those rights?
Yes, of course. First of all, I'll back up by what Dr. Franklin said. The first three words of the Constitution, say them together. We the people. All right, you are all people. I want to ask you a question. Women, girls who are sitting here, do you think you're as good as the boys who are sitting here? Do you think that you should have the same rights as those boys? Well, what if that didn't happen? That's the reason why I was involved with women's suffrage. Truly speaking, it's hard for everyone to understand, but I have experienced where women were not able to vote, but men could vote. And that's why I, along with many other women, we exercised our First Amendment right to assemble peaceably. And we did that by protests at the White House of the President of the United States. And that president, of course, was President Wilson. Now, the right that the First Amendment gives us to assemble peaceably, you can exercise that in many ways. And we did it by being silent, by not talking. We stood with suffrage banners of three colors, gold, white, and purple. And those banners let everyone know that we thought women should have the right to vote. And again, what we were doing was not against the law because it was guaranteed by the First Amendment rights. But men didn't want women to vote. Not all of them, but too many of them. And so they began to look at us taking this right of assembly and silently standing at the White House, and they arrested us. And they couldn't imagine, well, what are we going to charge them with? So they decided they'd charge us with such things as blocking traffic, obstructing the sidewalk. In other words, we were just in their way. And so, yes, it's true. In order to be able to have that right of assembly, I suffered, along with many other women, imprisonment. And that's why I'm wearing a pin that is a jail gate, because exercising that First Amendment right put me in jail illegally. And I must say, I'm not sorry I did it. And I'll ask you the question. What are you willing to be jailed for? Are you willing to be jailed for freedom, as I was willing to be jailed for the freedom of a woman to vote?
Well, thank you for sharing that. And that is some food for thought for us and all of our audience. Now, I wanted to jump to Ms. Harper as well, because you as well were a suffragist and exercised your freedom of speech, addressing fellow suffragists, even calling out their shortcomings. I recall, I think it was called "We Are All Bound Up Together." Another one about civil rights, a speech called "The Problem to Be Solved." And you also were one of the first African-American women to have poetry and books published. So you have some great examples of exercising your freedom of speech and of the press. Can you tell us what that experience was like as an African-American woman in the 1800s?
I sure can. Thank you so much for asking. So, as was stated, I got the opportunity to exercise the freedoms of both speech and the press. So, I was born, as I mentioned, in 1825. I was orphaned at the age of 3, but I was raised by my aunt and uncle, who actually ran a school. So I was educated a little bit past the 2nd grade, to about the age of 13. But at the age of 13, you had to pick up a trade. I went and I worked for a family as their nursemaid, but they owned a bookstore. And they saw that I loved to read and to write. So I had the opportunity at the age of 13 to spend a lot of time after all of my work was done, learning to read and to write with the books. And this really inspired me actually to become a writer. So the first works that I published were in my 20s, and they were books of poetry that were published. Then I also had the opportunity and the claim to be known as the first woman of color to publish a short story. And so this had never been done before, and I'm just very proud of that fact. But the other freedom, the freedom of speech, is really, I think, both things were very important to me, but as a woman of color in the 1800s, I had the opportunity to travel to speak about abolition, which was the getting rid of slavery and all of the things that were wrong about slavery. And I traveled throughout New England, I traveled in New York. I also had the opportunity to speak at the World's Fair and to speak about these atrocities as well. One of the other things that was very important to me as a public speaker was after the emancipation, I went to the South and I spoke to other women of color about uplifting our race and our communities through education and through economic development. I think that's it for me now.
Well,
Thank
wonderful.
you so much.
Of course, of course. Dr. Franklin, you are, I would say, perhaps one of the most famous of practitioners of that freedom of the press in American history. As a printer, I assume you would identify. Did you run into any challenges exercising that freedom of the press in your career?
Did I have challenges exercising
Yes,
it?
challenges of exercising freedom of press.
Yes, well, I was a newspaper man. I owned a newspaper and I had my own print shop. And so I did. Now, by the time we had that freedom of the press, I wasn't really an active newspaper man. I was a newspaper man before we had the freedom of the press. And so I can tell you, I got in trouble sometimes for some of the things I said. I found that the most effective way for me to for example, criticize the government as a newspaper man, to say something about someone that they might get upset about. Since this was before we were an independent country, I would sort of tell funny stories. I would create characters and have them say the things. So that way I could say, I didn't say that. That was my character that I created. And so you had to be, when there wasn't freedom of the press, you had to be very creative in the ways that you said things about people, even people, for example, the king or someone like that. They could throw you in jail. They could take your property. They could do all sorts of things. So obviously, when we wrote our Constitution and when we were talking about, I will not live to see the drafting of the Bill of Rights, but I was very involved in talking about what we needed, the freedoms that we needed here. So as someone who wrote for a living, as I often did, freedom of the press was a very important concept.
Thank you for sharing that. And, the discussion you made about being mindful of, say, the king or the power he might have if you were critical of him or the government so openly, has me thinking of your experiences, Mr. Penn. And I wanted to ask you both, especially with the new Society of Friends, the Quakers, your experiences practicing religion both in England and then establishing this Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, this province of Pennsylvania, how this idea of a freedom of religion maybe shaped your vision of what Pennsylvania would be. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, in my youth in England, if you weren't a member of the Church of England, well, you could get in trouble very easily. Even people who didn't go to church on Sunday were still supposed to donate money to the Church of England. Now, the Quakers had some different ideas about it. The Quakers thought that you didn't need a great big huge cathedral and all of that, but only a quiet place to listen to your conscience. They believed that nobody could be born better than anyone else. So why do we need kings and queens and princes and princesses and all those other expensive people to tell us what to do? We believe that war was unnecessary. That war is only the failure of diplomacy. We should find better ways to solve our problems with other countries. So why would we need an army and a navy? These kinds of things made the king very angry. They passed laws against the Quakers. They fined us for meeting in public and threw us into jail by the thousands. Some 15,000 Quakers were thrown into English jails in those days. Jails where they wouldn't even feed you if they didn't like you, where you could be tortured or killed and it wouldn't be in the newspapers. But the Quakers never gave up. They simply became stronger and more determined. You see, repressive methods like that have never worked. It didn't work with the Egyptians and the Israelites. It didn't work with the Romans and the Christians. It didn't work with the English and the Quakers, and it still doesn't work. But the king finally had to give up. His jails were full. He couldn't afford to chase those people around anymore. He decided to pass the Toleration Act, which meant you can be anything you want in England as long as you behave yourself, pay your taxes, and don't frighten the horses. He just wished we'd go away. And one day, he got his wish. For even the king can have a wish come true, you see. It turns out that the king owed my father, Admiral Sir William Penn, 16,000 English pounds sterling, millions of dollars of your money. My father had lent the king money during one of the wars when the king was short of cash. Kings don't have as much money as you think they do. They mostly borrow it and never pay it back. When my father died, I inherited his land in Ireland, all his money, and the debt that the king owed the family. So I went to the king one day and said, "What are we going to do about the money you owe my family?" And the king said, "Well, I simply haven't got it, but I have something I can give you instead." He offered me land, lots of land over here, almost 150,000 square miles. Now, he didn't really own this land, but that's the king for you. It's good to be the king. The king called the land Pennsylvania because he wanted to honor my father. This was very embarrassing. Quakers, you see, are not supposed to have their names splashed all over everything like some people do. It's supposed to be a humble and modest thing. I wanted to call the place New Wales or Sylvania or anything but Pennsylvania, but the king didn't have to change his mind. I tried to bribe the clerk to change the name on the title, but the clerk liked his job and his head and wouldn't take the bribe. How things have changed. So there I was, the largest private landowner in the world after the king. What was I going to do with all this real estate? I had an idea. I was going to perform what I called a holy experiment. I was going to invite everybody from everywhere to come to Pennsylvania and be free. You don't even have to be a Quaker. Anyone can come that wants to be free and safe. We published a charter of privileges, or more properly, a charter of liberties, guaranteeing everybody their rights. We cannot say that we ruling class will have all the rights and you regular people will have to do what we tell you. Everybody is equal under heaven. And so our charter of privileges guaranteed everyone's rights here in Pennsylvania. And a lot of the ideas in our charter of privileges or charter of liberties wound up in your Declaration of Independence and even your Constitution, where you, the people, will have all the rights that people should have. The right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That rings a bell. No matter though. So that is my small part in the cavalcade of history that led up to the Constitution of the United States. So now you know. If you didn't know, now you know. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. Now, we've heard from our friends here, and I know you've heard plenty from me. What I wanted to do, because we did call this a kids' town hall, is see if you folks had questions for our friends as well. We heard a little bit about each of these folks, about William Penn, Dr. Franklin, Ms. Harper, and Ms. Lewis. But what do you think, folks? Do we have questions about these folks or about these freedoms that they have helped exercise and embody? Freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. We'd love to hear from you. Oh, all the way in the back. Could you come closer so we might hear you, and then I can repeat it for our audience. So
the
there was a
question
question
is,
for,
were we, the Quakers, or myself particularly, afraid of what the Native Americans might do when we just showed up off our big boats and moved in? Well, most of the time, the big boats would pull into the harbors in Virginia and New York and New England and pull out their guns and say, well, we own the land now. Why don't you go someplace else? But we didn't believe that was fair. No one would like someone to come into their house and tell them, we are taking this house, you must leave. So we arranged to have a meeting with the native tribes to see what we could do about living together in peace. Now, I was told that the native chiefs would only talk to another chief, but the Quakers don't have chiefs. We're all in it together. We all make our decisions in a group. So they said, well, Mr. Penn, you were given this land by the king. You should be the chief. You've got to find some way to indicate that you're the chief. Now, the Quakers all pretty much looked alike. Same clothes, same hair, same hats, same faces. So my wife, Hannah, made me a lovely blue sash to wear at the meetings with the chiefs, so they would know that I was a different Quaker, I suppose. And then we offered to buy the land from the natives, from the Lenape, and they laughed. And they said, we can't sell you this land. We don't own this land. The land owns us. It was here before us. It will be here long after us. We live on the land and it supports us and helps us, but we cannot say we own it. So I thought, well, if we cannot buy it, can we pay you for the privilege of living here together with you in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania? Now that was all right. That made sense. So we paid that tribe for the right to live here. And they went home. The next day, another tribe came from another direction and said, we hear you are paying to rent the land. We use this land in the summertime, so maybe you could pay us too. So we paid them. We paid every tribe that came in and said that they also used the land. We were going to be fair. They called us Quakers the white men who don't carry guns. We did not have guns. We did not force them to sell us the land. We tried for always to live in peace with our neighbors, our brothers, our friends, the natives.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for that question. Now, do we have any other questions from members of our audience? Any of our students like to ask us anything? Otherwise, I know I can always come up with some questions on my own, but we would really love to hear from anyone else from our audience here. Keep my eyes peeled here. Well, if we have anything that comes to us, I'm certainly happy to help it.
Well, you see, the problem is, at their age, they're not so much worried about questions about the past. They're worried about questions about the future. Like, where are we going? Are we there yet? What are we going to eat? What time is it? All things like that matter to young people. It's when they become older and have experience that they begin to have questions about the world. Where did this all come from? How come we're here? How can we afford to live in it? Things like that. The questions you have now are very important to you. When will we eat? Where are we going? When will we get there? But eventually, you'll have questions that you can always find the answer to. Mr. Franklin, I believe, started a library here in Philadelphia. You can find the answers to all your questions there. You just have to keep on asking until you get your answer. Don't go away until you're satisfied.
That's a good thought. And with that in mind, maybe I'll ask our friends here, and may start with Ms. Harper on the end as well. Thinking of what's next, or what would you like to see for someone who has exercised many of these freedoms to try to pursue other freedoms and other rights? What would you have liked to see, or what opportunities would you have liked to see?
Thank you so much for asking that question. So I was a suffragist also, fighting for the rights of women to vote. But I actually never got the opportunity to see if women even received the right to vote. I think what really excites me is the fact that even without the right to vote, I still was able to exercise rights of the First Amendment to speak and to be heard and to actually make money from my writings. I also would like to have seen my race move forward, I think, in a way after slavery, so that they could be equal. And to this woman's question, I also was a strong advocate of the peace movement and, fought for the rights of all people, especially Native American people and people of color within my time frame. So I think I really would like to just see everyone have a freedom. I mean, we're all bound up in one great bundle of humanity. And a society that tramples on the weakest and feeblest of its members, it's going to realize the curse of its own soul.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And that's a great quote on that too. Now, Ms. Lewis, you do see women secure that right to vote, but even beyond that, following that, how would you and your fellow suffragists now exercises, right? Like, what would you work for next? What happens next for you?
What happens next is the big question. And as I listen to my historic friends here, as I might say, that vote, the right to vote that we have gained, because I have lived to see us win what Mrs. Harper and many other women before me fought for. But it is only the beginning. I'm going to ask you this question. Does our Constitution guarantee, with an amendment, equal rights for women? Is there an equal rights amendment guaranteeing that a woman is equal to a man in every aspect? And that includes equal pay. I think that is the next step. May I ask, how many years will it take until that amendment is made? I think it will be up to you to guarantee that our Constitution has an amendment that will say women are equal to men. That's what I'm looking for, and I'm still looking for it.
Thank you for sharing. Dr. Franklin, I'm thinking of a quote of yours that sounds optimistic. Of what do we envision? What do you look forward to or hope to work for? But I don't necessarily want to spoil that in case you already had it in mind yourself. Something referring to perhaps a rising sun. But if you had it, like anything you would wish to work for, or that you did, following, say, the signing of that Constitution, how did you wish to see its promise fulfilled?
That's a very good question. And by the way, you keep referring to me as Dr. Franklin. I should probably explain that, since I said I only went to the second grade. I only went to the second grade, but because of my scientific experiments and having published them all over the world, proving that lightning was electricity and really creating the science of electricity, I was given doctorate degrees from 6 different universities. I also started a university, which is right here in the city. So you don't have to stop learning when you leave the schoolroom, which I determined after I left the schoolroom in the second grade and had to go to work. You don't have to stop learning at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or whenever you leave the schoolroom. So just wanted to make that point. There were many things after we signed the Constitution that I wanted that we hadn't achieved. We had to make a lot of compromises. And to address what Ms. Harper has said, for example, one of the compromises that we made in order to have a constitution was we could not abolish slavery in our constitution. We couldn't get enough people from enough states to agree that there would be no more slavery. And I continued to work for the abolition of slavery after that. I became president of the Anti-Slavery Society here. I wrote a letter to Congress asking them to take up the subject of slavery. So that was one of the things. I also hoped that we would have a more democratic system than provided for in our Constitution. So that, for example, the states who had slaves could not count 3/5 of the number of slaves as people, and which means that they regarded them as property. So there were many things that I hoped would go. I was an optimist, I guess. I trusted the people of this country and the coming generations that they would be better than the ones who came before. I trusted that people would evolve into a more caring people. And so I think we always have to hope that the next generation, first of all, that our generation fulfills its potential, but always to hope that our children and the children beyond them will do better than we did, learn from our mistakes.
Speaking of learning, Dr. Franklin, the university you founded, what is the name of it?
Are you talking about the Penn Quakers, sir?
Thank you.
Yes, right.
Well, I understand our friends here. I'm thankful for you to have joined us. I believe our group that's gathered in Ebinger, you folks are joining us for the Freedom Rising presentation in just a moment. So I think we are just about out of time here, but I do want to thank all of our friends who have joined us throughout American history, all of you Philadelphians, I might add, to help share the stories of how we the people may exercise the freedoms we see along the wall here. But I don't want to hold you folks up anymore. I want to thank you for joining us once again and wish you all a happy Constitution Day. Thank you folks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
for the
very
use
much.
of the
Thank you for all of you.
All right, friends, thank you so much for tuning in. This was a wonderful way to celebrate some of our amazing historic figures. We are delighted that you were able to join us today for Constitution Day. It is always my favorite when we get to travel back in time and meet some of we the people who have made sure that the Constitution includes all of us, not just some of us. So with that, we're going to formally end this program, but I did want to remind you, we have a super fun program starting in 45 minutes with a constitutional First Amendment rock star, Mary Beth Tinker. Mary Beth Tinker, at 13 years old, when she was a student, she's going to talk a little bit about her case, taking it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and her experience as a student fighting for her First Amendment rights. So that is going to be an amazing program. I'm going to pop it into the chat right now so that you can register and go check it out. It's going to be a ton of fun. But with that said, I just want to remind everyone that we are so appreciative for you tuning in to our Constitution Day programs. We love having you join us. It's always so fun to see you all. And if you have any questions, I'll stick around for a couple more minutes. But I want to wish you all a very, very happy Constitution Day. 236 years of We the People, and we are so grateful that you decided to celebrate with us. So once again, happy Constitution Day. We will see you again at the next program with Mary Beth Tinker. Join it, join it, join it. She is amazing. We're going to have so much fun. All right, friends, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you again soon. Bye, folks. Yes, Robin, there is going to be a playback of this. It's going to be on our YouTube channel, which I will also pop in the chat right here. All of our Constitution Day programs are going to live on our YouTube channel, so you can watch them again and again until your heart is content. I'm going to pop that link in here so that you can check it out, and feel free to rewatch as you'd like. It's going to be a good one. All right, friends, thank you so much for tuning in. It was so wonderful to see you. It's so exciting to see some of your favorite historic figures. I saw some amazing answers in the chat. Frederick Douglass, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, some amazing people in there. I'm so happy that you were able to share them with us. But we are going to make our way to our next program, and we will see you all again soon. And once again, a very happy Constitution